This is in case my nose starts to run. I'm going to set the intention. My nose will not run. People ask me, how did I get into integrative medicine? I needed it to heal me. And I was guided by spirit. Though I was clueless about this for decades. This is not going to work. It has to be closer. Here we go. Throughout my life, God put people in my pathway to direct me in the right direction because clearly I was clueless. My parents, an astrologer, my friends, my mentors, my dearest friends, all were angels that the universe was giving to me to direct me in the right direction. Even if I couldn't understand or just wasn't listening. So first let me tell you about how I got to be a doctor. I reached my senior year of college planning to become a professor in chemistry. Then I visited the mother of a dear friend who offered me an astrology reading. You know, an astrology reading, I'm going into chemistry, I'm a scientist. I didn't think she would say much that would be interesting, but I'm an adventurer. So, why not? She surprised me with how accurate she was, with events and things about my personality. It was a little bit scary for the first time. And then she told me, you can spend time in a lab if you want to, but you're a healer. And the world needs you to heal. I may choke up some. On the outside, I rolled my eyes. And I started laughing because I laugh whenever I'm nervous. This was so absurd that she was saying that I should be a healer. Because the only real kind of healer that I knew about was being a doctor. I didn't really know what a healer was. But since I came from a family of doctors steeped in medical science, my best interpretation of a healer was that I should become a medical doctor. And in the fall of my senior year, do you know what I have to do to be able to jump through the hoops and the contortions I have to go through to become a medical doctor just before I graduate? She had no idea. And I was skeptical. Healing? Now, I'd heard about treating patients. I came from a long line of physicians from 1860, unbroken line of physicians. Both of my parents were doctors. I didn't want to be a doctor because I lived with doctors. My father was never there. He was very dutiful, but he wasn't there. My mother never liked any of the jobs she had as a physician. And, I mean, who'd want to become a doctor? I was going to be a chemist. Now, some of that had to do with Mr. Hoover. He was my chemistry teacher in high school. But I really enjoyed being in the lab. So I was going to be a chemist. Skeptical, yes I was. So I knew about treating patients. I knew about curing disease. I knew about preventing disease. I heard about my parents' successes and their failures dealing with people. But I lived in a scientifically based house. There was no discussion of God, faith, healing. The only healing in the 1950s that I knew about was laying on of hands by the Pentecostals. My mama said they were crazy. So I said they were crazy. And yet, when this astrologer said, you're a healer, I knew she was right. A little voice inside of me said, she's right. And I knew it. I never told my parents why I made that decision. They were just glad that the prodigal daughter had come home and one of their children was going to become a physician. I completed medical school and my residency, and then I began my life as a real doctor. This was when life started to get more complicated and much more interesting than I'd ever seen in medical school. I realized there was another dimension to these patients than the bodies and mental illness that I had been trained to treat. Let me tell you about the patient who taught me about energetic fields. I had my first job after graduating from my residency was at Twin County Community Hospital in Galax, Virginia. Ta-da! There, in the mountains, people don't come to the emergency room unless they are sick. And this woman arrived one night by ambulance with a racing heartbeat. As they rolled her in on the stretcher, she immediately begged me, turn off the lights, turn off all the lights in the emergency room, turn off all the lights. I thought this was strange. But I had already learned in medical school and my residency that crazy people can get sick too. So I put her in the trauma room, turned off the fluorescent overhead lights, and the only light bulb that we had in the entire emergency room was a 60-watt incandescent light that was on the crook neck lamp that I used for doing pelvics. Any of y'all remember that? That was my light bulb to examine this crazy lady who had a fast heartbeat. So I was in the dark, holding her hand, checking her pulse when they brought this light in, and I started to do my exam, and her heart gradually slowed down. I felt so much compassion for this woman, but I really wanted to prove to her that her fast heart rate was due to something else. It wasn't due to the fluorescent light bulbs. So I asked her for permission to turn them off briefly. No, it'll make the chest pain come back. And I said, really, let me do this for you. I promise I won't leave them on long. And she finally gave in and said, okay. It was a quiet, okay. I turned on the overhead lights and I watched the monitor. And her heart took off in this rapid, abnormal tachyarrhythmia, fast heart rate, and she started screaming, my chest pain is worse, I'm going to die, do something, turn off the lights. And I turned off the lights. And I apologized. And I said, thank you. And I thanked her for letting me run my little experiment. I held her hand while her heart rate finally slowed down. She didn't need medication. I didn't know what she needed. But I knew she needed to stay away from fluorescent lights. And I hadn't seen anything like this in medical school. I hadn't seen anything like this in life. Now, I know that many people have sensitivities to electromagnetic frequencies, and many of them are labeled crazy because nobody else understands them. And conventional medicine still does not recognize this as a real illness and entity. Another thing I learned in my journey towards understanding healing is that death doesn't stop healing. I was working at Lexington Memorial Hospital, I moved around a lot, in Lexington, North Carolina. There I briefly examined the body of a man who had been killed in a motor vehicle accident. His wife came to the ER to identify the body. I took her back to the room where his still warm, but decidedly dead, body was lying on the gurney. I had pronounced him dead in arrival. I expected her to look at the body, cry a little bit, and leave. No. Another lesson was coming. Instead, she picked up his hand and began to talk to him. And she kept on talking to him. And she talked about the kids. And she talked about the relatives. And she talked about the dog. And she talked about his garden. And she talked about the toilet that still didn't stop running. She occasionally paused and shook her head, or paused and nodded her head, as though he was responding to her questions and her statements. She was so calm and loving and present. She wasn't over there saying, woe is me, what am I going to do? She was having a conversation with her soulmate. I stood by for about 5 minutes, watching in wonder. Then I touched her shoulder and said, take as much time as you need. Then I walked out of the room and closed the door. I didn't understand this calmness and this presence in the face of her losing her husband. I had seen many reactions to death. I mean, people falling on the floor, rolling across the room, people screaming. I had never seen such grace. And I certainly had never seen talk and have a conversation on a higher plane with their loved one. Now, I know that our essence, our soul, the Christ within, is there even when these, is it called a skin bag? Skin bag? Yes, even when our skin bags wear out or get hit by a car and present to the ER DOA. She knew then that he was still there. Several years later, I married my husband, and we were getting wedding rings at Haynes Mall. And he started to experience chest pain. I looked at him, I quizzed him about his symptoms, and the guy was pale and sweating and clutching his chest. Clearly, he needed to go to the emergency room. I do not know why buying the wedding rings brought this on. I could not believe that this man that I had fallen madly in love with 12 weeks ago, I mean, I don't mess around, you know. 12 weeks ago was trying to die on me. We bought the rings. And then I drove him to Forsyth Hospital. He was admitted to the coronary care unit, and the ER doc that I knew personally came over and told me that he had an abnormal EKG, and it looked like he had had an inferior wall heart attack or inferior wall myocardial infarction. I was shown to the waiting room. I felt impotent to help him. I was lost and fearful and angry. How could he do this to me? All at the same time. And I decided to pray because there was nothing else I could do. I was desperate. This was a life and death issue. So it was worth a try. I didn't pray back then. I got close to a window, sat in a chair, and looked up, because that's where God's supposed to be. I apologize for waiting so long, but this is really important. I wept, and I begged, and I promised to stop smoking and get him to stop smoking. If only he would be okay in the morning. I remember doing this to the point of exhaustion, then resting and doing it all over again. The next morning, the doctor said, your husband was in severe pain all night long. He used huge amounts of morphine and nitroglycerin. We're going to do a catheterization because he may need a surgical procedure. And I waited. Then the cardiologist returned and said, we are discharging him. His coronary vessels are completely clear. He didn't have a heart attack. His EKG is normal now. Would you take this guy home? Wow. He actually seemed angry. that he wasn't going to get to do a procedure. Stunned, I gave my new hubby a big hug and we both threw away our cigarettes. I couldn't believe what had happened. Had my prayer really helped? Wow. No, I'm a scientist. I could come up with 5 good reasons for how that happened. Yeah. So I just discounted it. Now, I know that prayer works. Back then, I was forced by circumstances to reach beyond myself and beyond what medicine could offer. That was the lesson in healing that the divine sent to me that night. Next story. When I moved to Virginia to work in the ER at Martinsville, I met Elva. Elva is my oldest and dearest friend. She has been, it had been years since I had had a girlfriend. But she was more than a friend. Somehow she knew when I needed help, and she would call me up. It was just uncanny. She would call out of the blue, and she would talk me through my rough times. She even let me whine. And over the years, now Todd lets me whine. And over the years, I began to intuit when she was in pain, and I needed to call her and support her. Elva demonstrated the ability to connect to spirit. It was confirmed 3 years later when my father visited her three separate times after his death in 2006. And he had messages for me that she relayed to me. Sometime in the 1990s, I tried prayer again. Maybe I could do it right this time. I opened and was working in the First Urgent Care Center in Martinsville. I had a friend and a patient who was short of breath and had a cough, so I ordered a chest x-ray. And then I said, I need to come see you, Mark. He had a huge mass in his chest. So I told him, his wife, and his parents in their home. And he began the rocky path called chemotherapy for his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was in excellent physical shape and tolerated very high doses of very toxic drugs. But it wore him out physically and emotionally and spiritually. After his 4th round, he was so sick, he called me late one night. I don't think I want to do this anymore. I am so depressed and sick and tired. I just want out. I knew he was angry too. He was a devoutly religious man. He had taken care of himself. He had a family to take care of. He took care of them. He was a good person in the community. Why did he get this? He had told me, I can't pray anymore. Again, I rarely prayed with patients because I didn't really know what I was doing. But that's all I could offer him that night. And I was reading a book that had instructions. It was by Sophie Burnham, and it was called A Book of Angels. I could never get all the way through books like that. I mean, I would much rather read a medical text or something like that that would help me change someone's life, not realizing that prayer might change someone's life. But Sophie had a section on how to pray. Clear, concise instructions, how to speak directly with God, get through the static, say thank you, and get results. I hadn't tried it yet, but I figured my friend had nothing to lose. So we talked about what he wanted to accomplish. I got out of bed, got my knees, I didn't do that the first time, and grabbed the book for reference. I prayed in the present tense with no negatives, that the oncologist would come in the next morning and tell him, your white count is okay, you can go home, we're done. Then I added, thy will be done. I told Mark that everything would work out, and he was so much stronger than he thought he was. I reassured him that I was there for him and hung up and fell asleep, feeling a little bit silly, but curious and hopeful. At least I'd done it right this time, on the knees, no negatives and positives. The very next morning, he called and bubbled over the phone. You are not going to believe this. The oncologist walked in and said, your white count is normal if you don't have a fever. Your white count is normal. If you do not have a fever, you can go home. Do you believe that? And he did go home. And he's still alive over 20 years later. I now had a study of 2 prayers over 6 years. It was a small study. Even so, I fully realized that we are not limited to time or space or existing knowledge. The universe was still teaching me about healing. Now, why was I so thick-headed? Why didn't I get it sooner? Certainly my lack of exposure early in life to faith and prayer contributed to my skepticism. My adoption of approaching life with a scientific method to fill this void helped crowd out interest and time to become familiar with faith. And when people talked about faith, I didn't have anything to hang it on. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And the other thing that was happening simultaneously was that I was experiencing mercury toxicity from the silver fillings that I received before puberty. I experienced bulimia and depression when I went through puberty. These were not due to a Prozac deficiency. They were due to mercury toxicity. My allergic rhinitis and my severe runny nose that I developed in my 20s in medical school was not due to allergies or antihistamines. It was not an antihistamine deficiency. It was due to the mercury. I struggled with my weight for close to 50 years. It was due to hypothyroidism caused by the mercury. All of this got better when I had my silver fillings taken out and I chelated the leftover mercury out of my body. I like to blame some of my slowness in becoming aware of the divine was due to the toxic effects of mercury. I'm right. For once, I got my physical body cleaner and healed from the mercury. I went out looking for the divine. I had never searched before. The divine had always come to me, and I didn't know it was the divine. I initiated contact. I wanted contact, and I made contact. I decided to try some in-depth experiential spiritual work. I met Gloria Karpinski, who did a reading and changed my life. She's an internationally known intuitive. I began to have hope that I had self-worth because I suffered from not feeling good about myself. And that was better after I got the mercury out. But there was healing to be done still. Then I attended a series of workshops with Gloria. Initially, I still had a little bit of skepticism because I couldn't find a place to integrate what I was learning and what I had seen with my own eyes, which was completely counter to what I'd learned as a scientist. Then the movie What the Bleep came out, and I saw a way to blend metaphysics and quantum mechanics. I got it! Then I learned about healing touch. Years before, my husband first told me that I was an angel. He repeatedly said that I had a magical healing touch, and I had friends that told me that, or patients that told me that. When he said it, I rolled my eyes and I smiled. But a tiny, soft voice inside me said, he's right. You have a healing touch. I had nowhere to put this information back then, so I blew it off. Later, when I took Healing Touch classes, I consciously and deliberately took responsibility for being a healer for the very first time. I understood that I was what the astrologer said I was. I was a healer with a healing touch. Then I turned 60 last fall. I had been working on healing myself for years, but I didn't know it. And the universe had been working on healing myself for years, and I didn't know it. I was mentally and physically healthier than I'd been literally in 50 years. And I now knew and trusted spiritual healing. Healing occurs on many levels. Personal healing through prayer by Myrtle and Charles Fillmore was the inspiration for the establishment of unity. Healing works on all planes: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. We are each holistically one, even though we have all of these subdivisions within our energy fields. If we ignore any of these aspects, any of these parts of who we are, I think we are a little bit less healed than we can be. So take care of all of you. I gave a talk once, and it was titled, Body, Mind, Spirit, Ignore One, Heal None. As I look back over a career that spans more than 30 years, I'm drawn to the story of a nurse in Lexington. She was in the prime of her life. She was a lovely spirit having a human experience, although I wouldn't have used those words back then. Then she got diagnosed with widely disseminated breast cancer. She prayed about this. She decided against chemo. Do you know how much courage that took, how much faith that took back in the mid-1980s? She knew her time had come, and she was comforted by this. She continued to work some time as she lost weight, and then she went home to her family. Her profound grace during this time was healing not just for her, but for everyone who had contact with her. Healing is not about the physical body. It's not about curing the patient. Here's a woman whose body is riddled with cancer, and yet she is the embodiment of wholeness. She lived in a place of oneness with the divine because that is the truth of who she was. Ultimately, true healing is not just about the physical again. It can and does manifest in the physical, but it is a physical manifestation of our knowing our oneness, and our oneness with each other, and our oneness with the divine. So, that's kind of how I learned about being a healer and what being a healer was. A woman that I barely knew points me off on a career that I was dead set against. Another woman expands my understanding about energy. Even the energy from a light bulb can affect our physical health. And now I know that everything is energy. Everything in the universe is energy. I witnessed a woman having a conversation with her husband after I pronounced him dead, and even I feel his presence. I knew that it was a conversation and not the ramblings of a grieving woman. And now I know that truly life never ends. 2 times, when I am still not certain that I even know what faith is, I reach out in prayer to whatever is that's beyond myself. And I've got amazing results. Myrtle Fillmore wrote, "Sometimes we pray to a God outside of ourselves. It is the God in the midst of us that heals. It is God in the midst of us that heals. With our eye of faith, we must see God in our flesh, see that wholeness for which we are praying in every part of our body temple. Lastly, I embraced a woman who, through prayer and meditation, peacefully shows grace as her physical body fails her. And now I know that in the midst of all things, even in me and in you, the divine is present. All my life, the universe was calling to me, and I wasn't always listening. What is the universe calling you to do? Are you listening? Are you ready to be healed?